Hi, and welcome to the Basstravaganza. This is the Kootowis Bridge, kind of an infamous spot in local history, and I was involved in a way. I began fishing here in 1971, during the first summer I ever spent in BC. I was living in a plastic shack on Wreck Bay a few miles away out on the ocean. You might be able to hear the surf. Uh, and that was the last summer before they made it into a national park. And you couldn't you could even drive out onto Long Beach in those days and camp overnight. And some weekends there were maybe 1,000 people. You couldn't drive onto Wreck Bay, but they were double parked on the road and huge parties on the weekends, and people from all over Canada, from New Brunswick and Quebec to BC, people from all over the U.S., people from uh, Europe. It was not quite the 60s anymore, but boy, it was pretty close. And they were partying around these huge bonfires and sleeping on the beach. And there was lots of cheap wine at those parties. And there may have even been some illegal substances and pretty women, too. It's been so long ago, I can't remember anymore. What I do remember is there was a stream just inland from the beach, this stream, Kootowis. And I could drive there down the logging road with my little 98cc Hodaka motorcycle. And I'd hike into some great fishing for cutthroat trout and jack coho salmon. So that summer, I would drive in and break off an alder branch and break twigs off of it. And then I'd wrap the tip around, this is not a good example, but wrap the tip around the handlebar of my motorcycle. And I'd use this as a stringer, and I'd string up 8 sea-run cutthroat trout off my left handlebar and 8 jack cohos off my right handlebar. It was legal back then. And drive back to Wreck Bay and pass them out around the campfires at Wreck Bay. So it was legal to do that in those days. You could keep 60, you could keep 8 trout and 8 salmon, and it was a great way to meet pretty hippie chicks around the campfires. So I don't do that anymore. And there are no more cute hippie chicks anyway, so it hardly matters, does it? And there's no more campfires allowed on the beach at Wreck Bay now, but I digress. What I'd like to point out is that I fished for trout all over North America. Quebec, Ontario, Wisconsin, Michigan, Tennessee, Georgia, Arizona, uh, California, Oregon, and all over BC and Vancouver Island. And this little stream right here was the finest wild trout fishery I've ever seen in my life anywhere in the world. So the next time I came out here, that's why I wanted to come back and film here. It was the following summer. That would have been 1972. And I drove out here in my old panel truck. And I had my first job in BC that spring. I digress a little bit, planting trees for Ministry of Forests. And when the job ended, I wrote them a letter expressing some of my opinions about clear cutting and the way they were logging. And they said I was blacklisted for life with BC Forest Service. So I didn't get out to a great start. One of the things I remember I suggested was that if they were going to keep logging the way they were, they should forget about fish habitat and just go into invent some kind of edible plastic. And think of this, 1972, think of how far ahead of my time I was. Get some edible plastic and put a little computer in these and make some plastic trout. And when there was water in the river, you could come down in there and catch them and eat them. And then after logging, when the streams dried up, and a couple days after the rain stopped, then these plastic trout would go hide under a rock somewhere and just wait until the next time the rain came around, and then you could go catch them again. But anyway, I got off on the wrong foot with BC Ministry of Forests, and so I drove out here, and like I like to do, came out at the crack of dawn. I parked just up the road, and I was walking up here in the near dark, right up to the bridge here, coming up this road, and ready to get the dawn bite. And I looked down, and holy crap, the bridge was gone. So you can see these logs along the side of the river here. These are called brow logs, cribbing. And then these big long logs that go span across the river on top, these are called stringers. And they have to support the weight of the biggest loaded logging trucks in the world. So you can see that these are not nearly as big. These are like half the size of the old logs. There's more of them, but they're not nearly as big. And they had just put in a brand new bridge, and they were getting set to clear cut the other side of the river here. And huge logs, much bigger than these. They were 5, 6 feet in diameter, and beautiful, clear, the most perfect, huge cedar logs you've ever seen. And in the middle of the night, somebody came along and sawed them all up. And it was low water in summer, so they just split those huge pieces down, all 2 feet long, and split them up into shake blocks and drove away and stole the bridge in the middle of the night. So I knew right away that it was more than just thieving of shake blocks. That was an act of political terrorism. It was a statement about logging practices. You don't go cut up big road bridges just to make a few bucks. People out here were pissed off about the way the logging was happening. And somebody decided to make a statement, and they sawed this whole bridge up and stole the wood. So I was standing there, and I had an empty panel truck, and I started thinking, well, man, this looks a little suspicious. Maybe I should make an exit from here. You couldn't go over the bridge. It was all sawed up. So they went in the middle of the night, expert job, and sawed the thing up and split it out. And I thought I didn't want to be around here if anybody came along. Well, 10 seconds later, what did I hear? A pickup truck coming along, and this was back in the days when BC government actually had personnel in the field. They actually had a Ministry of Forests with people that got out of the office and went, and they had Ministry of Environment in those days with actual people that went out into the field. And so who should pull up but the pickup truck with the Ministry of Forests guy? And it turned out that they were picking this morning, all these big heads were coming, bureaucracy people, to plot out the demise of the clear cutting of the old forest on the other side of the river. So next thing instantly showed up was, I think it was the Ministry of Environment pickup truck showed up, and then the Federal Ministry of Fisheries pickup truck showed up. So there was all these ministry people standing there. The Ministry of Forest guy was first, and I worked for federal and provincial and municipal levels of government. My normal expectation of government employees is that they're pretty timid and tame, and but not so in this case. Because in fact, when they blacklisted me from Ministry of Forests, and my letter of criticism they sent, I guess I used some bad words, and they said a lady shouldn't ever have to listen to those kind of words. And this Ministry of Forests guy here, I won't repeat the words because there might be ladies listening, but he walked up to the bridge and he looked down and he said, "Ah, shake cutters." And then from then on, well, I won't repeat what he said. All I will mention is that it rhymes with bucking fastards. And he got very, very excited, and he started ranting, bucking fastards. And I tried to explain as well as I could. I had nothing to do with it. I think I probably was suspected, maybe whoever it is that keeps tabs of things that people like me do in my file somewhere. I'm probably listed as a suspect in that, but it wasn't me that did it. I had nothing to do with it. I just happened to be a tourist that came here at that moment. And So I kind of snaked my way out. It wasn't me, and I left. But anyway, they finally went and rebuilt the bridge and logged off the river, and that's what the rest of the show will be about. But it turns out years later, eventually I moved to Oregon, and I think I was when I was living in Oregon. This was decades later, and came back up to visit. I went out to visit Tofino one time, and I was having a coffee at the coffee shop and talking to some guy that I'd known years ago, and I'd known him for decades, and I'd had gone over and had coffee in his house. I'd driven by it hundreds of times, and we started chatting, and somehow the subject of Kootowis and the bridge incident came up, and he said to me, "You know what? I was the one that did that, and the shakes are still on my roof." So, and this was somebody that if he'd asked the first 50 most likely people in town, he would never have been one of them. He was just a local person that was fed up with the logging, and he decided to make his own statement about it and got himself a free roof out of the finest quality cedar in the world out of it as well. So anyway, that's my little story about Kootowis Bridge. When European immigrants came around, they called it Indian River because it produced such phenomenal runs of trout and salmon that the natives built a village at the mouth and used it as the local grocery store, like an Aboriginal Save-On Foods or Walmart. The natives called it Kootowis, so now it's gazetted as Kootowis Creek. Now, in my Tale of Two Rivers series, I've been documenting how clear cuts triggered huge debris slides that blasted down rivers, ripped out the banks, filled in the deep pools, and left wide, shallow channels of shifting gravel where there'd once been deep pools and stable riffles. So you're probably expecting me to head off into that same rant again here, but I'm not, because that's not what happened here. Vancouver Island is generally one of the steepest places on the planet, but the Kootowis watershed is one of the few flat spots on it. 10,000 years ago, after the last ice age, this area was a shallow ocean mudflat. Now it's low, flat, swampy ground. So instead of draining as a fast, powerful river raging down a steep mountain valley, it was a slow, lazy stream that wound its way down to Tofino Inlet through an ancient forest of enormous red cedar trees. The clear cutting began here in the mid-1950s, and the watershed was half logged by the 1970s when I got there, and almost totally clear cut by the 1990s. You have to understand a few things about logging in order to comprehend what happened here. The original forest was composed of some of the biggest, oldest organisms that ever grew on planet Earth. They're easy to cut down, but hard to move around. So the loggers would build a road that would end in a landing and set up a huge machine called a steel spar or a yarder. They were mostly made here in Nanaimo by a company called Medill. The intent of the spar is to provide lift. If there's not enough lift, the choked front end of the log will jam into a stump or a boulder. This is called a jill poke. So lucky for you, I happen to have my own Medill steel spar here. So let's tighten up the guy wires, tighten up these backstays here. And look at that, Bob's your uncle. Let's go logging, boys and girls. So here's our choker cable, big steel cable. You wrap it around the log. This is called setting the choker. So it has this clip on the end. You got to wrap the cable around the log, and then you clip it in place. That's called setting the choker. You've got that log choked now. Now if you just drag that log across the landscape, you're going to pick up all that other debris. So that's the reason for our Medill steel spar here. But now that you've got your Medill steel spar hooked up, you've got lift, and you can drag that log across the landscape. into the landing. And now you can drag that log right across the landscape. Drag it right into the landing and put it on a logging truck. And now we're logging. Now, just another side trip here to emphasize my previous comments that the logging protests did not originate with the tree huggers in Tofino. I had a friend on the Sunshine Coast in those days. He had a one-ton truck and he liked to ramble around the logging roads and explore some of the nice trout lakes there. And like me, he despised the clear cutting that was happening at the time. The difference was that I was a hippie fresh out of college and he was a logger, or at least he had been until he quit that industry in disgust. His father was a logger. He grew up as a logger, so he knew how to operate one of those Medill yarders. I remember talking to him about a virgin valley that the clear cutters were pushing the road into and how pissed off he was about the way that they were logging it off. It wasn't until a year later that he mentioned to me that he had driven up that valley in the middle of the night, turned the motor on in that giant yarder, slipped it into gear, and watched it roll off the edge of the road and crash down the mountain in a pile of rubble, and then drove home. Neither this event nor the Kootowis Bridge event were ever reported as political protests in the news, but the top execs at the logging companies got the message. Not everybody was happy about what they were doing even then. Now, as you're dragging these huge logs around, you also snag and drag anything between you and the log you're yarding in. Branches, stumps, hollow, rotten logs. Loggers call this slash. In the old-growth cedar forest, there's an incredible amount of it. When you log this way across flat land, like Kootowis, all that slash that gets dragged along tends to fall out in the lowest areas. That's why you never log across stream channels, especially ones that support fish. Except here. In many cases, the companies decided to drag those huge logs directly across the main channel and its tribs. This deposited enormous amounts of wood debris into the channel and left it there. And remember, this is a stream that does not have the power to clear its channel during a flood. When the loggers dragged the huge cedars across the channel, the tips sometimes stuck into the clay bank, and they just unhooked the choker on these jill-poked logs and grabbed onto another log. Whole trees that are worth thousands of dollars nowadays were just left stuck there in the bank because it wasn't worth the time to figure out a way to get them out. These jill-poked logs became a series of permanent dams that backed up the flow and formed the foundation of monster debris jams. After logging, there were still thousands of big cedar logs lying around in the clear cuts, and hundreds more lying right in the river channel. Over the years, the Ministry of Forests encouraged cedar salvagers to harvest shake blocks from this burned-over wasteland, just like Mr. X had harvested them previously from the Kootowis Bridge. Okay? The shake cutting generates enormous amounts of wood waste, all 2 feet long. Knots, sapwood, rotten hearts. In the biz, this is called spall or spalt. On a slope, it rots back into the ground and becomes soil. At Kootowis, it all floats around in the winter nowadays, and the whole valley bottom turns into a sea of spalt, which flows with the current until it hits an obstacle, and then it backs up into stupendous debris jams. Finally, this would be maybe the 1980s, Ministry of Forests allowed shake cutters to go right into the channel during summer low water. The huge logs there were sawn up and gutted. The cache wood was flown out with a helicopter, and mountains of spalt and sawdust were left behind right there in the middle of the creek. As the ongoing corporate industrial rape of the Kootowis watershed progressed and the wild fishery disappeared, many people registered more formal protests at any level of government they could think of. The government of the day announced a bold new program called Forest Renewal BC that would change logging forever, and a sub-bureaucracy called Fisheries Renewal BC that would begin to assess and repair logging damage to streams. One of the projects they funded was the Kootowis Watershed Restoration Project. At long last, somebody was going to step in and do something about the mess here. The problem was, nobody knew what. Everyone could see there was too much wood in the channel. There was money available, but nobody had ever attempted restoration of a huge trashed wasteland like this. I'm going to show you here some helicopter footage shot just as we were beginning to go to work there. So that was Kootowis in the 1990s. There was too much wood in the channel. The worse it got, the more the government and the big companies they promoted denied that there was any problem. But in fact, the wild fishery collapsed. There were still a few cutthroat and cohos that returned in the fall to try to lay their eggs in the lower reaches, but all fish passage further up was blocked by trash wood debris, so the fish just went extinct there. Not long ago, I had walked along this creek and waded right up its channel. Now it was a jungle of smashed wood and thorny brush, so dense you couldn't get near it. You literally needed to hack your way in with a chainsaw just to get a look at the stream. There was no chance to make a cast or land a fish. There was so much wood plugging the channel that it could not drain, so the whole river bottom area turned into a giant lake after a big rain. there was too much wood in the channel. This kind of logging and this kind of attitude led to the huge protest blockades that eventually got the big logging companies booted right out of Clackwood entirely. Finally, in 1998, the provincial government stepped in and funded the Kootowis Watershed Restoration Project. I worked there for a couple months in 1998 and again in 1999 before I went back to school and spent the rest of my life working behind a desk. The KWRP continued for a bit into 2000. In a combined total of only a few months of work with unskilled labor, we brought that stream back to life. So now let's head back up in the chopper. I'm going to show you here some helicopter footage shot just as we were beginning to go to work there. Here you can see our KWRP crew crawling around on the river during the first few days on the job, trying to get a grip on the madness. There was a movie out at the time called Humanoids from the Deep, and that's what we called ourselves. There was too much wood in the channel. So that was Kootowis back in the 1990s. And that was me back in the 1990s. I was looking forward towards a lifetime of doing this kind of work, but that didn't happen. Instead, the tides of politics ebbed and flowed, and the Kootowis project was snuffed out after a change in government. It's long forgotten now, along with the creek itself and the kind of work we did there. Along with, over the next 20 years, the province's Ministry of Fisheries, the Ministry of Environment, and most of Vancouver Island's wild Chinook and sockeye and coho and steelhead and sea-run cutthroat trout, and most of its wild recreational and commercial fisheries. Nowadays, the logging companies look after the salmon streams, and the government doesn't get very involved in the fate of the wild fish habitat within the loggers' domain. I want to point out that this is not just any old creek in my world. This was the finest wild trout stream I've ever seen on planet Earth. I could hike along it and wade up it from the ocean to the bridge over 2 kilometers up. Not only that, it remains the finest salmon trout stream in one of Canada's premier national parks. But the stream has no relevance to the park it's in. Few tourists ever go there. It was hard to film that narration for the intro because there were tourist helicopters flying constantly over Long Beach, so close they drown out my voice. But the choppers never come up here to fly over Kootowis, even though it is also inside and adjacent to Canada's premier Pacific National Park. This is the dark backside of Tofino, a trashed wasteland where tourists fear to tread. When I worked on the KWRP, I had a vision of a future with a living stream and hiking trails that ran along it, and a vibrant recreational fishery for cutthroat and coho and steelhead. Now, decades later, the whole watershed is still a train wreck, the recreational fishery is all but non-existent, and the trails we chopped in are ancient history, along with many of the spur roads that access them. It's ridiculous to even think about hiking or wading along Kootowis Creek today. In fact, there's now only one spot where humans can get near the stream, at the bridge where I shot the intro to this episode. Everything else is such a tangle of bush and swamp that few humans ever venture into it. And the only major human activity within the watershed remains clear-cut logging. The scrapping of the Kootowis project and almost the entire concept of watershed restoration here on Van Isle, along with the concept of paying attention to the damage clear-cut logging was causing to our streams, was central to the political regime change here after the turn of the century. Now, 20 years later, the foot is on the other shoe. We are world leaders in frankenfish and also in wild fish extinction. The great bulk of the commercial salmon around Van Isle are frankenfish native to the other side of the globe, grown mostly in pens owned by one really rich guy in Norway. Every wild stock of Chinook, sockeye, and steelhead is struggling. Many are threatened with extinction and many are already gone. Even the recreational trout fishery here on Van Isle is now mostly a commercial operation, harvesting frankenfish with gene stocks originating anywhere other than Van Isle and anywhere other than the lakes they're dumped into. Now the question is whether it's worth investing the time and money into saving any stream and the wild fish it supports. The Kootowis deserves a memorial, some kind of headstone for its grave at least. And it deserves a champion along with the entire concept of preserving wild salmon and trout here on Van Isle and the habitat that they require, and maybe even the recreational fisheries they support. And I plan to do just that in upcoming episodes. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza. But I'll never forget that Ministry of Forest guy screaming, "Bucking bastards! Bucking bastards!"